All right, yeah, so as Nathan said, I am presenting on the question of our time, analog versus digital, a real contentious issue among certain people. And so I think the idea behind this is hopefully we can answer once and for all, what is superior, analog or digital? And so to do that, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of the theory of signals and systems, which I know Pat has traumatized you. Nathan, I don't think you've taken a real class on this, but I assume you've done some of the stuff through like controls class. I'm sure you've been schooled extensively in controls and like Laplace transforms and those fun things. Yes.
I'm self-learned in this subject.
Okay, great. So once we have a working knowledge of that, we can actually properly do analog to digital conversion. And I have a small little example of analog to digital conversion here, where we have your analog atmospheric temperature signal. We measure the sensor, what it says in terms of voltage every X number of seconds. You get an still analog but discrete measurement. And then you convert it to digital signal with ones and zeros, measuring any number between 0 and 16. So we'll learn what exactly is happening with our knowledge of signals and systems. Then we'll do a case study, music. In the interest of time, I haven't included more case studies, but I think music is really the quintessential analog versus digital debate, and I think there's a lot to learn. I know Nathan may disagree. Nathan may be more of a VHS versus Blu-ray and whatnot. You know, I believe, now I don't know. I forget if VHS uses digital or analog audio. Do you know?
I'm
I'm gonna
more
guess.
concerned about picture quality.
Okay, I'm gonna guess it uses analog audio. I know it's more about picture quality, and I don't have much about that in here, but so be it. And then to take things really to the next level, we're even going to do a small introduction to information theory, which I think is particularly interesting. So as far as what inspired this topic, I thought of it actually when Leo was presenting about photography and the difference between analog photos or film photos, which is analog, versus digital photography, and how for photography there are some genuine advantages to analog. And so we'll kind of discuss that for audio. And so this topic has been of interest to me since I took my introduction to signals and systems class back in 2014. So I actually still have this textbook and I have the CD for this textbook. So I ripped a lot of diagrams from that because it has all the diagrams in there. So you're going to get a textbook's worth of knowledge, more or less. I was also inspired by this book I read, I think like freshman or sophomore year of college, called The Idea Factory. And so that's about Bell Labs and the various personalities who worked there. And there were quite a few colorful personalities who worked there. And one of them, Claude Shannon, developed information theory. And that's kind of what familiarized myself. This is very much not a technical book or a pop science book. I hate pop science books. It's more of a history book, but it did a good job due to the author being knowledgeable about it, of explaining information theory despite being a history book. And so that's kind of what introduced me to it. And then a lot of this comes from Shannon's actual work. So he published a paper in the Bell Labs Technical Journal entitled A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Later, when he realized that he invented an entire field of study, he published that in a book and entitled it The Mathematical Theory of Communication, because it really is its own field. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And so when we're dealing with an analog system, the way you think about it is you have your signal that varies with time. So you can think of it as like some sort of waveform going into your system. And then you have another signal with some similar or different signal coming out. And so X of t and Y of t are both signals, and they're being put through a system. And so just to give you an example of a system, I have a very simple RC circuit. This is the example we'll be using throughout the example because the math is extremely easy to work out. Another example is a car shock system. So this is a mechanical system with signals. In this case, the signal is the height of the pavement. The input signal is the height of the pavement, and the output signal is the height of the car. So you can imagine if you hit a bump in the curve, x of t will look something like straight up, straight. And so if you have no string, if it's like no spring, if it's perfectly sturdy, the car will also go straight up, and your passengers won't like that. If you have a spring with no shock absorber, you'll hit the bump and it'll cushion your blow, but then you'll keep bouncing up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. But if you properly damp it, you can really cushion the blow without bouncing around like crazy. And so that's a intro to differential equations question that they'll ask you, is how can you make this properly damped? And then one of the fun things about systems is there are similarities between, you can kind of draw parallels between anything. So this circuit right here is an exact analog of the shock absorber we have here. And the reason for that is because resistors mathematically perform the exact same as shock absorbers. Springs like these perform the exact same as capacitors, and mass and its inertia perform similar to inductors in circuits. But we don't need to worry about the math there. I just thought that was an interesting example. So in terms of actually analyzing analog systems, and once again, we're still purely an analog world, there are three different ways we can do this. We can use differential equations, we can use Laplace transforms, which hopefully you're somewhat experienced in, and as a third option, we can use Fourier transforms, which maybe you're less experienced in, but I assure you are very fun and exciting, so we'll get to those. But we're going to start with the differential equation. And so we can write an equation for the circuit, basically just saying x of t, the voltage across here, is the same as your voltage across your resistor, IR, plus your voltage across your capacitor, C, or Y of t. And in fact, we know that our current through math and physics is the capacitance times dy dt. So if you don't remember that, that's not a big deal. And so we can write a equation for this. We can turn RC, the units of RC is seconds. So we can turn that into the time constant, tau c. And we have this nice little differential equation. And whatever we plug in for x of t, we can now solve the differential equation. And so we'll just stick with this differential equation from now on to define the circuit and not worry about circuit math, because that's not what this talk is about. So we have our differential equation for the circuit. And so what we're going to do now is kind of use math to figure out what the response is going to be. So this is time for the call and response portion. If we were to not have a battery connected, so have 0 voltage, and then suddenly connect a battery with voltage 1, what would the y of t curve look like? Any takers? Yeah, more or less. So we'll show it. So it starts off growing steeply, and then over time it grows less and less and less steep. And so this unit step response is important for systems because it's often really easy to measure. And so if you're just looking at a system with no understanding of it, you can apply a unit step to it, and there you go. You figure out a little bit more about the system without even necessarily knowing these equations. So now we're going to apply a different input. We're going to apply the unit impulse. And so this is a weird ass function that hopefully you were taught at some point in school, but it has a value of 0 at all points except for 0. And at 0, it's undefined. And if you integrate this, the area under 0 is 1. So it's kind of infinitely tall here with the area under it being 1. So any guesses for what the step response to this looks like? It's weird. It's tough to say. So if you do the math, the step response initially starts up high and then it works its way down. And so you may notice that the relationship between this step and this response right here is that this is the derivative of this. So if you take the derivative of this, you pull this minus 1 over tau c out to the front, multiplied by this negative right here, and you have 1 over tau c times what you have right here. So you'll notice the derivative of the unit step function is the unit impulse function. Then the derivative of the output of the step function is also the derivative of the output of the unit impulse function. So I'm showing you this one because it'll be of importance later on for understanding the response to just how systems perform in general. So that's differential equations. Any questions about that?
Yes. Can you bring back those two equations again?
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a while since I've done this for like circuit type things. But I know from nuclear training, we would call the top one, that 1 minus e to the something, a characteristic buildup equation, and the bottom one a characteristic decay equation.
Yes.
Are those real mathematical terms, or is that just like a simplification? It's really more, I guess, of a language question than a.
You're saying the characteristic buildup and characteristic decay.
Yes.
I am not familiar with those.
Okay.
I am sure they are real terms because these are very important mathematical functions for engineers in particular. And so I'm sure those are real words for it that aren't made up, but I'm not familiar with them. They might not tell. I learned this through the point of view of a sophomore in electrical engineering. So they don't even worry about making this practical at this point. They just want to kind of teach you the math. So you probably learned it more from a practical perspective. So they might actually give it a name for that reason. So yeah.
Cool.
Alrighty. So that was differential equations. Now we got my good friend, the Laplace transform. And so I purposefully kind of made this presentation so you don't have to know how to calculate a Laplace transform. All you have to know is how to look at your table of conversions and it'll spit something out for you. And so the idea is these functions are functions of time, but we're going to turn them into functions of some made up variable that we don't know quite what it means, but later on this presentation, you will realize what it means, s. And so when we turn x of t into the s domain, we can also find an equation for the system. And if we multiply these two Laplace domain equations by one another, we get the output y of s. So we can't really multiply this by anything. We can't multiply x of t by anything to get the output. But in the Laplace domain, it's as simple as multiplying to understand what the relationship is here. So this is why Laplace domain is so important for controls, is you can just have all of your systems, including like your feedback loop, and you can just do the math in the Laplace domain much more easily. So first, we will convert this equation to the Laplace domain. So y of t becomes y of s. We got a Leo. Truly coming in at the worst moment. Leo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, so I will spend 1 minute getting you up to speed and then we'll barrel on. So we're doing analog versus digital. And so I'm just introducing how we analyze analog systems. So I showed that we can analyze them with differential equations, and we get, if we put a unit step into this circuit, we get a step response. If we put a unit impulse, we get our unit impulse response, and they have these distinct looks. But doing a differential equation is a huge pain in the ass. We're going to do a Laplace transform instead. So, and the point of this presentation, Leo, is that you should be able to hopefully follow along with most of this. I did this with the point of view of someone who does not have differential equation experience. So try to follow along. I wish you luck.
I'll do my best. I can't make any guarantees, though.
That's just fine. So we're going to solve for h of s now. If we look at these equations, h of s is equal to y of s over x of s. And so it's equal to 1 over tau c over s plus 1 over tau c. And if you remember your differential equations, if you remember your Laplace transforms in your tables, you might remember that some number over s plus some number is a very common Laplace transform to get. And actually, we can look at our table, convert this back to the time domain, and we will get this equation right here. So does anyone recognize this equation? Any takers?
What answer are you looking for? I've seen something
Sure.
like it before.
Like a characteristic decay, but then it's multiplied by something. So maybe looks a little, yeah, okay, so there it is.
Yeah, so it is literally the same thing as our impulse response. So we're learning a little bit more about our system. So if we plug an impulse response in, if we plug an impulse into our system, what we get back is the time domain version of our transfer function. So we're starting to see there's some equivalence between time domain and Laplace domain in terms of what's going on. But the meaning of this impulse response is maybe still a little like, what is the use of this? And so what I hope to teach you is what is the point of this impulse response? And I promise this will be of minor relevance to analog and digital signal processing. I'm also just, I like this topic, so you have to bear with me. It's my week. All right, so we got time domain, we got Laplace domain, and it turns out here's how we relate these two. So you can do this crazy weird integral called a convolution integral, where you relate your x of input to your h of t. And if you do this math, which you don't have to understand at all, it will spit out your y of t. So you can do some math with x of t and your unit impulse response, and it will spit out y of t. We don't have to understand this math. We also know that you can just multiply x of s and h of s, and it'll give you y of s. So what we're learning is that between the time domain and the Laplace domain, there's an equivalence between convolution and multiplication. And in fact, it turns out that the opposite is true as well. And this will be relevant to the presentation later on. So if you multiply two signals together, you can get, that is the equivalent of convoluting those two signals in the Laplace domain. And we will be doing that during our digital processing. So I'm going to take it a little aside and talk a little bit more about convolution. And I have this great 10-minute YouTube video from Eugene Kutoryansky, who this is the best video I've seen on this topic. And I had a GSI who explained convolution this way to me. My professor never did it, but the GSI did it in discussion section, and all of the sudden convolution made sense. And so the idea is when you have a linear system, whatever you put in, like whatever your input is, here versus here versus here versus here, your linear system doesn't remember what its state was a second ago, and it doesn't have foreknowledge of what its state is going to be a second in the future. And so you can just look at this little impulse, we could call it right here, and you know that when you submit this impulse, you'll get the impulse response. And then you jump forward, and maybe it doesn't have to be an impulse. Here, it's a little rectangle. So you know that when you apply a rectangle to your system here, it's just going to kind of go down like that, because, and we can just assume this system from the YouTube video is more or less the same as our system. So when you apply this little impulse here, it just goes down. And so you can put all of those little rectangles next to one another and add them on top of one another. And so what you see is all of these signals lined up next to one another. And so when you add all of these up, it starts by going up when this is very high, and then when it's low, it goes back down. And so it's kind of hard to explain from this video. The reason you do the integral is because if you imagine these rectangles becoming infinitely thin, when they become infinitely thin, that's when they become equivalent to the unit impulse function. And so now you have the unit impulse function, and this is why this is showing up when you're trying to figure out what the output of the system is. So you don't have to understand that completely now. We're going to go through two examples that'll hopefully help you understand. So we're going back to our RC circuit. We have our unit step impulse, our unit step input, and we have our impulse response. And so the idea is, right, like this very first rectangle here, we are having one very small impulse response. And so what we're doing is we're experiencing this whole impulse response. And so we know we start at 0 and we pick up kind of this amount right here. So this 1 over tau c is how much our output is increasing by. And then as we go forward and forward in time, we're stacking more and more and more of these on top of one another. We're stacking more of these impulse responses on top of one another until we get all the way to the end. And the height that we're actually at is the area under this impulse response. And so what you see here is convolution. And so hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to give you one example where you can try to guess what the system would actually output. So now we have this kind of regular input. Every 1 second, it pulses for a second, and then it stops for 4 seconds. So if this is our impulse response, can either of you guess what is going to happen to the function when we have this input, and also when we have 10 volts, and also when it's 0 volts? What is the output going to do?
So we have a, okay, so it's going to be like kind of like a build up for when it's pulsing, but then whatever it gets to when that 1 second is over, then we kind of have the decay.
I mean, it's,
Another build up.
if you look at the picture on the left, it's basically the same thing.
Which one?
This one?
The input and output function with the linear system. I mean,
Yeah.
it has
So it doesn't
your input buildup with a drop off, and then another input buildup, and it has that buildup, decay, buildup, decay.
Yeah. So build up, decay, build up, decay. And so if you really think about it, you can understand it in terms of impulse responses, but you don't have to. Like, I think you have a good feel for it either way. And so just to ask a question, what would happen if our tau c were much, much, much larger? So if our tau c were much, much larger, what would happen to the impulse response?
If your tau c was really large, then your 1 over tau c would be lower, and it would also take. So I mean, the actual amount that would build up would be higher, or sorry, would be lower.
Mm-hmm.
And then.
Correct me.
Yeah. So I'll just say, because you got it. The impulse response would be flatter, so it wouldn't be as tall and would extend out longer.
Yeah.
And so what that transfers to in practice here with your output is it also flattens your output. And so what we actually have here with this RC circuit is a low pass filter. So it only lets your low frequency signals through, and it smooths any signal like this. So if you increase your time constant, you make a kind of a more effective low pass filter. So if you have like a gigantic capacitor, it's a more effective low pass filter. And so if you just have an infinitely large capacitor, this will just be the output will just be flat, because your impulse response is just flat, or the closer it gets to flat, the closer your output is. So you don't have to understand that. That's just kind of what an impulse response is, and hopefully gives you a little bit better understanding of what we're doing in the Laplace domain. So we've done the time domain, we've done the Laplace domain. Now we're going to do a Fourier transform, okay? And so this is Pat's worst nightmare. Any periodic waveform of frequency omega can be represented as the sum of sinusoidal waves of frequency n omega, where n is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, up to infinity. And so the idea is the characteristic time of this waveform is t0. So from here to here is t0 seconds. And so the frequency is 1 over t0 hertz. So we can throw on one term, and unsurprisingly, it already follows it pretty closely. So now, if we have terms of 2 omega and 3 omega, we get it to follow even more closely. If we add another 7 terms, we get it to follow more closely. And if we add 90 terms, it's almost exactly dead on. And so what this is saying is any periodic waveform is really just the linear combination of sinusoidal waveforms. And this is true of any periodic waveform. You can create it out of sine waves.
So the end of the day is all digital, just advanced analog.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I wanted to say yes and I wanted to say no. There are some ways it is and some ways it isn't. We'll get to that. So another example here, just to drive the point home, is we have these M waveforms and you see the same thing. 5, it's close, 10, it's closer, 1000, it's very, very close. But in terms of what's actually going on, so you can imagine we have this sinusoid of frequency 0, so that's just actually a straight line to like go up or down just to get the average of this at the right place. But then we have a sinusoid of magnitude 0.43 and phase shift of 0. So to really do this right, each of the sine waves is going to have to shift left or right to some extent, and that's too much work for us to worry about. But just know that that is happening, and that's happening when you do your low-pass filter. It's happening in all of your systems. And so we have different amplitudes, different frequencies or phase shifts, different phase shifts for each of these. And as we add more and more and more, we get closer to our repeating function. So these are Fourier series. These are not Fourier transforms. Fourier transforms are completed on non-periodic functions. And so I'll give you an example of that. So we have this periodic rectangle step of like a rectangle signal, rectangle signal, rectangle signal. And so a non-periodic function, the way we kind of model that with our knowledge of Fourier transforms is we think, okay, let's keep expanding our period. Let's keep making the distance between these wider and wider and wider until the distance between each rectangle is infinity. And so what's happening to our Fourier series as we do this? Well, you can imagine we have these waveforms 5 seconds apart. So each of these are 1/5 hertz apart from one another. Then we have our waveforms that are 10 seconds apart, and now each of these are only 1/10 hertz. So they're getting closer and closer. 20 seconds, they're getting even closer. And so once we get to just a rectangle function, now instead of having all of these individual lines, like that now instead of having a series, we have an integral basically. So once again, we've gone from discrete to continuous. We have this line here that looks the exact same as what's going on over here. And so we now have our Laplace transform. And so this is now infinitely many sinusoidal waves, infinite number of frequencies is required to describe this signal right here. So it's kind of mathematically weird to think about, but you'll see it actually is much more straightforward than we realize. So we're going to go back to our friend, the RC circuit, and we're going to do this. And so an interesting property of Fourier transforms you'll see is x of omega times h of omega equals y of omega. So it maintains that property of the Laplace transform. We're going to look at our Fourier transform table. We don't need to know how to take them. We're just going to look at our table. We're going to do the math. You might notice that this is starting to look a little familiar, and we're going to solve for h of omega. So y over x equals h equals 1/tau c over j omega. So this is the frequency plus 1 plus tau c. And so if you're thinking, this looks a little familiar, you're right, because it is. It is the same thing as the Laplace transform. You just put j omega, j being the way that electrical engineers write I, because I is current for electrical engineers, but this being the imaginary number. You just sub in j omega for s, and that's what your transfer function is. And so, excuse me, we can now kind of figure out what's going on here with this transfer function. So we can look at all of the different omegas, all the different frequencies, and we can graph it out. And so that's what this Bode plot is they're looking at frequencies from 0 all the way to 100 of a certain frequency. This frequency, I believe, is equal to 1/tau c. And so what you see is that at the very high frequencies, your transfer function is very, very small. And at the low frequencies, your transfer function is 0. The decibels are 0, so your transfer function is equal to 1. Because this number right here is minuscule, it basically goes away. 1/tau c over 1/tau c equals 1. And so what you see is that this is in fact a low pass filter. So we were talking earlier about how this is a low pass filter. Now we're actually showing it in the frequency domain. And so once again, we've kind of established a similarity between, okay, what's actually going on in Laplace domain versus what's happening to our function. So we know signals and systems now. We've learned EX216 at the University of Michigan, basically. We can't do any of the computations, but we can look at a table and we can apply what we've learned here. So good enough, we know what a Bode plot is, we know what a Laplace transform is, we know what a transfer function is. So we're gonna just look at music now. So let's look at music. You have your record here. I picked a particular classic, and on your record are grooves that are etched into the record, and these grooves encode a waveform, which is the sound that you're listening to. In practice, these grooves actually are two-dimensional. So if you really look close at the grooves, you can see that whatever's etched into one side is not at all lining up with whatever's, or not completely lining up with whatever's on the other side. And so that's giving you stereo sound. So the way your needle moves in this direction is left, and the way your needle moves in the other direction is right. So that's, if you were wondering how they encode stereo sound on records, that's how they do it. And what you get out is a signal. This signal right here is pulled from the textbook. It is actually what a trumpet playing a B note sounds like. So it's not just a sine wave, because it's not playing an exact B note. In fact, we can figure out what's going on here. We can look at the Laplace transform of the sound. And so when you look at sounds that an instrument makes specifically, you play at a certain frequency, and that's the note you're playing. So 980 hertz is a B, but you also are playing at undertones and overtones. And so you have double and triple and quadruple the frequency of that, but they're all kind of in sync with one another, which is why you see this periodic pattern in terms of the signal. And so once again, Fourier transform is kind of demonstrating its usefulness. But additionally, we have learned, thanks to the Fourier transform, what timbre is when it comes to music. So the difference between a oboe and a trumpet and a human singing and just about any other sound is where these peaks are relative to one another, and then how much noise there is between them. So how much is actually on the frequency or the undertone or overtone versus other underbrush, it describes it as. So this is what analog music is. And so just to learn a little bit more about that, now that we once again know our Fourier transform, we can look at all of these different sounds. So if you're saying ooh, you have this frequency pattern right here. Ah has a slightly different one, and E, now you're moving kind of, you can see all of them have this low frequency and this high frequency, but this other thing has ooh and ah at about the same frequency, and E is being a little bit higher pitch. And when you kind of listen to yourself say them, you can kind of sense that E is a little bit higher pitch. And so speech, because you're not making a smooth, constant sound, it's kind of all over the place, but this is a typical speech spectral density. And so there's a lot at the low range, and then it slowly peters out and peters out and peters out as you get to a higher frequency, which makes sense because there's a limit to the range of human hearing. And so what I have here is it says 31 hertz to 19 kilohertz. As a rule of thumb, you can just say 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, or 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz is the range of human hearing. It's fun to look at some of these other ones, including like the hearing ranges of fish versus frogs versus dolphins, which can hear the most high-pitched noises. Dogs can also hear higher pitched noises than us, hence the dog whistles. And so it's just interesting to see. We have a pretty decent range. We don't have the best range. Looks like ferret here has a very nice hearing range, and the little brown bat has a very bad hearing range, but it's interesting. So now that we know Fourier transforms, I'm going to do one other case study, which is, this is for audiophiles, but not the subject of the talk. You can actually run a Fourier transform on input and output of your earbuds or your headphones and see what's going on. So these Samsung Galaxy buds are considered like some very good earbuds. I just picked them because they had the highest rating on some audiophile website for earbuds in the $300 or so range. The next slide has an example of what a less good pair of earbuds does. Does anyone want to guess what earbuds I put on the next slide?
Apple EarPods.
Nope.
Skull candy. I don't know.
No. So there's one brand that's
Beats
known
Audio.
for
Close.
Beats
There's
Audio.
one- yes. Sorry,
And it's going to be super high on the bass and lower on the treble.
So I looked at all of the Beats headphones, and most of them are not so bad. This was a common complaint they got like right when they launched, is all of their things are super high on bass. And I think for the most part, that probably was true at the beginning, but they've more or less corrected for it just because they do want to appeal to audiophiles. But this is, I believe, their first generation of earbud, and very, very heavy on the bass. So if you think 10 decibels, so 90 to 100 decibels, that's about 3 times as loud, square root of 10 technically, but about 3 times as loud from here to here. So your bass on these headphones is 3 times louder than your bass on the previous headphones. And people like that. Like, that's, audiophiles don't like that, but your average consumer, especially if your average consumer is listening to hip hop music, they like to feel the bass. Now, this is something more or less that can be, maybe not this 3 times, but this is something that can be achieved with just messing with your equalizer settings. And it's something that can also be compensated for by messing with your equalizer settings. So just because it's not perfectly flat doesn't mean it's the end of the world, but this is pretty extreme. And this was the most extreme Beats one I found.
You can't always mess with your equalizer settings.
Well, if Spotify is giving you trouble, then no, you can't mess with your equalizer settings. So, all right. We are ready to digitize music. We know what we're doing. We're going to use our signals and systems knowledge, and we're going to turn analog into digital. So let's get started. We have our analog signal, and we're going to also look at it in the frequency domain. And so this you can imagine as the Laplace transform. We're used to only looking at the right side of that on the previous slides, but technically we have positive and negative frequency. It's a weird math thing. Don't worry about it. And the idea is that there are all of these noises, but above a certain frequency, we're not really going to be hearing anything. Even if there is noise, it's not in the range of human hearing. So even as an audiophile, you're not particularly concerned about preserving those sounds that are at 100,000 hertz or anything like that.
Can sound that is beyond hearing range, that's particularly loud, damage your hearing?
I believe it can. I haven't looked into that. It's certainly those things, like the ringtones you can get that are 20,000 hertz, so your teacher can't hear it. When people played those for a long amount of time in like class, those made my ears hurt. So I kind of assume
But
it
you
can.
could hear it though.
I could hear it, but like even the higher ones, like maybe made my ears hurt. So I don't know.
I thought it had something to do with the fact that, like, or at least this is one aspect of hearing damage, is it's like a resonant frequency for whatever the hairs that actually detect.
Yeah, the cilia in your cochlea.
If you don't have that, it wouldn't necessarily cause that type of hearing damage.
I mean, that makes sense because that is what happens, and that is the mechanism of hearing loss. But I don't know. I think that I've observed it anecdotally, but I have no idea. So. All right, so how are we going to digitize this? Well, in the time domain, we're going to multiply this signal by what is called an impulse train. And so every TS seconds, we apply an impulse signal. And when we multiply these two functions together, we get what is this function that is green. So every time the impulse signal is applied, the area under it is kind of the equivalent of right here. And so that's why it's represented like this, even though technically they go to infinity or whatever. So I don't expect anyone to be able to guess this, but I'm giving you a chance. Does anyone want to guess what this looks like in the frequency domain?
Okay, so we got to stack like a whole bunch of.
Yeah, but now instead of having these long signals, you're stacking with unit impulses that are instantaneous.
Is it going to be just like a peak in the middle?
So it's not quite going to be a peak in the middle. It's going to be peaks at every single unit impulse function. And this, if this doesn't make sense right away, don't feel bad. It took a long time for the process of convolution to make sense. It took a lot of actually computing convolution integrals before the explanation that I gave in 2 minutes on that one slide really made sense to me. But if you think about it, if you have your frequency domain right here and you run the impulse train function, you have one after another, you're going to go over the frequency domain one at a time with these unit impulses. And so when you convolute them, you're going to get one after the other. So if you don't get it, you can just take my word for it. But this is what the output, all of these little peaks in the frequency domain looks like. And so now we have our sampled signal. And if we apply a low pass filter, we can turn it right back into continuous signal. It just has to be a very special low pass filter. And so the idea is we have our original spectrum. This is an example of a undersampled spectrum. So if these are too far apart, these are going to fall on top of one another and things are going to get messed up. We'll talk about that more next slide.
Yeah,
if we Nyquist sample it, and apply a brick wall filter, which brick wall filters are impossible to actually engineer for a variety of reasons, then the idea is this brick wall filter is a Laplace, or is a Fourier transform. So under it, it has a value of 1, and everywhere else it has a value of 0. So what you return is your actual original spectrum. And then if you oversample it, you can use a Butterworth filter, which is a real filter that is achievable. And once again, you can return your input. So this is what it looks like in the frequency domain, but in the time domain, you're turning this function right here at the bottom back into your analog signal. So just like that, we've converted from analog to digital. So let's talk a little bit about undersampling. In practice, what does undersampling look like? And so this was the function that I was showing. So I'll just give you an example. And this process is called aliasing. So we have a 500 hertz sinusoid sampled at every 450 hertz. And so when you look at what the actual samples are, you'll notice, okay, this is a whole different frequency. This doesn't look right. And so it appears to the eye, as it says right here, like a 50 hertz signal. And so what you're actually doing on the frequency domain, and the book didn't have a diagram for this, and I was too lazy to make it. But rather, this sine wave right here doesn't look like this frequency domain right here. This sine wave is just a single peak at 500 hertz. That's what the Laplace transform of this looks like, because that's all it is. It's a wave at 500 hertz. So you do your 500 hertz, and then you'll notice that each of these peaks are moving by 1 of the sampling frequency. So your 500 hertz peak is going to move to, if the sampling frequency is 450, 500 is going to move in one way to 950 and to 450 more than that, and on. But it's also going to move backwards to 50 hertz. And so that's what you're doing. And if you apply a low pass filter to this, it's going to spit out this 50 hertz function. So this is what happens when you undersample your signal. And it's especially dangerous because you are doing it in a constant rate. And so it really messes it up like this. This is one of the things that I actually thought about during Leo's talk, because this aliasing effect also happens in photography. And so if you have this very consistent pattern with a consistent frequency between each of the bricks in this case, and you turned it into like a bitmap image or whatever, you have a bunch of just individual pixels. If you shrink that image too much, you have the exact same aliasing effect where the distance between your pixels is kind of consistent with the distance between these bricks. And so you have what's called a Moiré pattern. I don't know how that's pronounced, but you get this effect. And I'm sure all of you have seen this at one point and another when you're dragging pictures or stretching them out, because you are having this aliasing effect. And this phrase aliasing is also when you're playing your video games and doing anti-aliasing, that's what that is as well. I don't understand I don't want to explain anti-aliasing, and I didn't read about it beforehand, so I can't. But it's similar. It's smoothing is what you want to do So I don't know. You can read the Wikipedia article for it if you're dying to. So this is just a fun aside about undersampling, but we're going to go back to the question at hand. So maybe the better question to ask is, when is digital as good as analog? Because analog seems to be perfect. At least we've been assuming it to be perfect so far. So when is our digital as perfect as analog? And so this introduces us to the Nyquist criteria of it needs to be above a certain frequency. And if you want to see what's actually going on in the time domain, I pulled this animation from Wikipedia. And so what you're seeing is it's slowly pulling more and more and more frequency. And as you get more and more frequency, it's getting more close to mimicking the curve. And when you get all the way to omega equals 10, you have captured this whole frequency curve. So even if you go further and further and further, you have exactly replicated this with your digital or almost digital signal. And so this is the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem. There's that name Shannon that I talked about earlier. And so if a function x of t contains no frequencies higher than b hertz, it is completely determined, giving its ordinate at series of points spaced seconds 1 over 2b apart. So that's what's happening right here with this brick wall filter, is f of s equals 2b. If you sample it at this frequency, you're capturing all the information. You don't have any of this overlap that you're seeing. And so you have it perfectly sampled. And in this case, finally, digital is as good as analog. It's not any worse than analog. So we're showing that, okay, digital can keep up at least. And so for music, the way we actually do that is you can encode onto a CD-ROM. That's the one I included here because you can actually take pictures of a CD-ROM, and you have your digital signal. You actually have your ones and zeros encoded into the CD. A flash drive, you can't really take a picture of how it encodes its data, but it's a series of gates or something on a silicon wafer. And so that's another way you can store your digital signal. And so in practice, this is how it's done. Digital audio is stored at a frequency of 44,100 hertz, most commonly at least. And this is more than twice the entire audible frequency. So if you have an analog signal, it gets it all, baby. This rate, it's a fun story behind how it's chosen. Sony and Philips are two makers of various storage media, including VHS tapes, Nathan. And so Philips wanted it to be 44056 because this was compatible with NTSC standards, National Television System Committee, including how things were encoded onto VHS tapes, but also how television signal was encoded. And they wanted 14 bits per audio sample because they thought that's how many bits we need to encode each of like the height of each of these peaks. But Sony ultimately prevailed and got 44,100 hertz and 16 bits per audio sample. So Sony got their way. But this does raise another question, because we've been talking like, okay, our analog signal is perfect. But this is only 16 bits per audio sample. So whatever 2 to the power of 16 is, you can't get any distances any more precise than that between those. So if your analog signal is perfect, your digital isn't quite as good. So raises the question, are these 16 bits that you're encoding onto your CD enough? And to answer this, we need to utilize information theory. So we're not done. You may have thought we're done. We're not done. We got to do some information theory before we can really finish this case study on music. So this brings us to the guy I was telling you about earlier, Claude Shannon. So this is, he was an engineer at Bell Labs, and I'll give you a quick little bio about him. He was actually born in Gaylord, Michigan, and studied electrical engineering at the University of Michigan, at least his undergraduate. He then went to MIT to get his master's degree, and he wrote a master's thesis entitled A Symbolic Analysis of Relay and Switching Circuits. And this became the foundation of digital circuit design, and was actually described by one science writer as, oops, I forgot to close these quotes, the most important master's thesis of the century, which I think is accurate. And so basically what he did is he created the symbolic language for digital circuits. And 1936, this is before digital circuits. They exist, but they're not super common. They're used in like telephone switching operations, and they're used like in the computers at like Bletchley Park, where they're decoding Nazi signals or Japanese signals and breaking codes. And so but semiconductors are not even common. So these digital circuits barely even exist, and we have Claude Shannon inventing the world of digital circuit design. So after that excellent work, he goes on to join Bell Labs during World War II to work on fire control systems as well as cryptography. And he did a lot of cryptography work. I got an example of a one-time pad right here because he had some important proofs about how these one-time pad works and how they're unbreakable. And so his cryptography work led him to eventually publish this memo that I told you about earlier, a mathematical theory of communication in the Bell System Technical Journal. And this memo, which became a book, was really the foundation of information theory. The book I was telling you about Bell Labs goes into a lot of detail about his life outside of Bell Labs. And actually, after working at Bell Labs for 16 years, he went on to join the MIT faculty. And he just had a lot of weird interests that he liked more than doing his actual job. So juggling, unicycling, chess. He created one of the first chess AIs that was very, very simple, but was able to play chess like against a child or whatever, and maybe beat a child. And he invented all of these devices. And the book goes on and on about how there's one particular device he was obsessed with, the useless box, where you would flip the switch and then a little finger would pop out, flip the switch back and close. And it would just keep doing that over and over again.
We had one of those on our boat.
Nice, nice. Yeah, so he was obsessed with these. He was just a real character. But I am impressed by his work in particular of the scientists described at Bell Labs, because he kind of created entire fields before there was a need for them, because his strength was like actually categorizing things and explaining things, and also doing the mathematical derivations for them to make sense. And we're not going to go into those mathematical derivations. We're just going to go into the descriptions for this. But that's what he was doing in both this master's thesis as well as the creation of information theory. So in this work, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, he introduced this model of communication. And so you have an information source that's transmitting a message through a transmitter. It creates a signal. So once again, we're talking about signals. We love signals. But as the signal is being transmitted, there's a source of noise that's confounding the signal. And so that noise may mess things up before it gets to the receiver, and the message is ultimately decoded. And so this model was revolutionary for its time, because it kind of is a way that can be used to describe any form of communication or information transfer, including VHS tapes even. This is cool, 5 boxes connected to one another, but what was impressive about his paper was the fact that he actually mathematically defined each of these steps and described how the process actually works out. And so we're going to go into the mathematics just a little bit. So Claude Shannon describes this. Information, we got to define information to do information theory. Information is the resolution of uncertainty. So information can be quantified in terms of bits by the second order logarithm of the number of possible outcomes. And there are good reasons why we do this that we'll get into in a minute. So a coin flip, how many bits of information does that communicate? You said 2, Pat. Nathan, do you have an answer?
It's one bit.
It's
one bit, yeah, one bit. So log 2 of 2 is 1.
What if it lands on its side?
Oof.
We'll get into that. We'll get into that. We will kind of get into that.
Information theory is blown out.
Exposed. It's still, Leo, with the possibility of it landing on its side, it's still extremely close to 1 bit of information. It's more than 1 bit, but we'll get into that in the next slide. It's not because the chance of it landing on its side is low, it's not like choosing a number between 1 and 3. Like it's not, which would be between 1 and 2 bits. It's very, very close to 1 bit. So how many bits would drawing a card from a deck of cards be?
How many cards are there in a deck of cards?
52.
So log 52, what is that? I don't know.
Either. I think it's 5 point something. Yeah, 5.7. And then I have an example here from Shannon's time. Here's maybe even after his time, like after the paper was written. But here's, because I don't want to go into how many bits are on a flash drive, here's just a punch card, and it has 80 bits on it. So we get introduced to the importance of using bits rather than rather than saying we're transmitting 52 possibilities, it makes more sense to say we're transmitting 5.7 bits when we think about 2 punch cards. So how much information does 2 punch cards have if one has 80?
It would have 81.
What?
Or, no, it would just be 160 then?
It'd be 160 bits. And so that's the idea, is we need to use this logarithm, because if we have 2 things, it should transmit twice as many. It shouldn't translate like 2 to the power of 80 times as much information. It should transfer twice as much. So that's why we use the logarithmic scale. And so I'm not sure if you've done statistical mechanics in your schooling, which is similar to this, but we're describing this information as entropy. That's a commonly used word, and the way they do entropy is very similar to the way entropy is taught through statistical mechanics. And so another fun aside, we're going to return to the coin flip example. If it's a perfectly weighted coin with a 50-50 chance on either side, then 1 bit of information is transferred. But if the coin has heads on both sides, we're not resolving any uncertainty by telling you that the coin says heads. So we're actually transmitting 0 bits of information. And so there's an equation if there are 2 possibilities for what's being transmitted. So let's do some letters and see how many bits of information we're transmitting. So choosing between A, B, C, and D, how many bits of information is that?
2 bits.
2 bits, yeah. But what if they don't all have equal probability? So what if there's a 50% chance that it's B, 1/3% chance that it's A, and a very low chance that it's C or D? Well, we can apply this equation with 4 points, and we see that actually, if we do all the math, every single letter transmits 1.626 bits of information. So we're not transmitting 2 bits of information. And so what that's saying is, can we find a way to encode this where transmitting 1,000 letters requires only 1,600 or 1,626 binary digits on average? And then there's a little aside here. If we just do it the normal way, it'll take 2,000 binary digits. And so if you think A can be transmitted 00, 01, 10, 11. So any guesses for how we can compress this data, if you will, how we can transmit this more efficiently?
Oh, I've definitely done this. I'm totally blanking.
Can you do like some sort of pairing?
You can. You're jumping ahead. You can do a pairing, but if you do just a equal pairing, you'll have like AA, AB, AC, AD, and you'll have, what is that, 16 different choices, and each of the 16 different choices will be 4 bits. So you're not really compressing your data at all. So I'll show you. So you can encode it into a tree. And so this was what is it called? Heuristic, or that's not the word, a procedure developed in a term paper for an MIT class, actually, for how to compress this data. And so the idea is B is the most common. So we're going to encode it with only 1 character. But we're going to encode, if it's not B, we know it's going to begin with a 1. And then if it's A, the second most common, it'll be 10, and so on. And this works. You can't simplify things further. You can't say make B0, A1, C10, and D01, because you're going to start getting things mixed up, and you're going to like say, is it BA or is it D? Because they're both 01. But this procedure right here, you can immediately encode or decode every one of these signals. So we can crunch the numbers, and the expected length is 1.666 bits. So we were looking at 1.626 bits. This gets it pretty close. Transmitting 1,000 takes, better, not optimal, because we know 1.626 is optimal. So to optimize even further, Nathan, we can do your strategy of pairing things, tripling things. So we know that, for example, BB would be the most common. So if we encoded BB as 0 and then kept going down and down and down and down, we would get it down to 1.646 bits. triples 1.637, quads 1.633. And so getting closer and closer to the optimal encoding. However, as we make these longer and longer and longer, our tree becomes a huge hassle. And to add to that, the symbol probabilities from message to message, what if they're different? Then we need a new encoding system for every message. And now we have to communicate the encoding system as well, which takes up extra data. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. It's a very basic introduction to file compression.
So, like, could Cyborg Industries compression work by basically saying, like, if the letter A is received, it is the Avengers movie in entirety in like Blu-ray quality?
Yes. Here's the issue though, is there's an assumption that the Avengers movie in Blu-ray quality is the only thing that could be sent. And so what's being communicated in practice by Cyborg Industries is 0 bits of information. So is it possible? Yes. Is it transmitting 10 to the 80 or whatever megabits per second? No, not quite. But good thinking, and maybe that's, I know that's not what they're doing because I've read their patent, but yeah. Anywho, all right. So yeah, here we go. So this is important for our analog to digital discussion. We're ready to talk about it. All the examples so far haven't included any reference to noise, which is super, super, super important to signal reliability. So when you think about it, you have this digital signal, and we'll start with digital signal, but analog and digital signal feels noise. And you actually run it through a noisy system, you get things kind of bouncing up and down. You get some jostle, and this one, it's only kind of jostle when it changes because it can't change instantaneously. But you can even get just like false positives and false negatives. And so we kind of need a way to quantify this noise, and that's what Claude Shannon does in his article. So I have an example right here, and we'll talk about noise in digital signal more in a couple of slides. But in analog signal, the way you combat noise is you amplify your signal. So this is why, like, when you're recording sound, you might plug it into a preamp before you actually start recording it to kind of diminish this noise as it goes into your computer or goes into your recording equipment, what have you. And so the amplifier, if it's barely amplifying it at all, you're mostly seeing noise. If it's amplifying it like crazy, you're almost seeing your exact signal. And so what we're measuring here is the signal to noise ratio, which is extremely important for information theory. So signal noise ratio measured in terms of decibels typically, and it's sorry, there's some fireworks going off. My dog does not like those. She's under my desk.
Is this part of that big conspiracy that is going on?
Yeah, I think the police probably gave these fireworks to some local teens to really set us and specifically our dog on edge.
Yeah, to interfere with this presentation specifically and prevent this forbidden knowledge from reaching us.
Well, we haven't even answered the question of is analog better than digital. So I think that makes sense, honestly. They wanna censor the truth. You can speculate which side is wanting to censor the truth because you don't know yet. So anyway, signal to noise ratio, very important for information theory, and 2 or 3 slides will actually apply it. But it's important for digital signal too. So when you are actually sending digital signals, there is a certain rate of bit error no matter what the signal you're sending. So on a wireless medium, basically 1 in every 1,000 bits that you send, it gets flopped or flip-flopped. And so it's incorrect. Copper wire, it's less frequent. Fiber optics, it's even less frequent. But you are having mistakes when you're sending your digital signal because you also have, it's not like there's no noise when you're sending digital signal, just like the analog signal. And so it's going to screw up. And so in practice, what digital signals have, especially wireless signals, is some form of error detection. So I've included some very, very basic examples of error detection. There are much more advanced ways to do it than this. But one way to do it is for every 7 bits of information you send, you can send a parity bit. So add all of these 7 up. It'll either give you 1 or 0. And so that's your code. And then when you read the data, if there's one error, you will realize, hey, all of these add up to 0, but my check bit is 1. So there's an error, and I need to re-download this set of 8 data points. Now, the problem with this is if there are 2 errors, well, we didn't detect it, shoot. And so, or if there's 1 error and there's an error in your check bit, which is 2 errors as well, doesn't work. Nathan, you have a question?
Why not just have a check bit after every bit?
That's a way to do it. Once again, if both of those bits are in error, it is still messed up. So there are more elaborate ways that you can use fewer bits to get the same level of coverage. And actually, I have one example right here where I'd say this is, I don't know if this is more reliable than your strategy of giving every bit a check bit, but this is a 2D parity check. So now you have a matrix of values, and in one dimension, every line gets a check bit, and in the other dimension, every line gets a check bit. And so if you just get one bit wrong, you don't have to re-download the data. You just look at it and say, oh, in both dimensions, it's saying this bit is messed up. So we know something's up, and we're going to correct it. And we know exactly where it is in rows and columns. Now, if you have a 2 or 3-bit error, you can detect it, but you can't necessarily correct it. So if it's a 2-bit error, you would think like, okay, we don't detect it in the rows, but we do detect 2 errors in the column. So we don't know what row it's in, but we know that there's an error. We got to re-download the whole thing. Same for 3 bits. 4-bit or more errors can only be detected in some cases. I would go as far as to say most cases, but they can't be detected in all cases. So drawback of this, too many check bits. It's a draw bit of your mechanism, Nathan. Too many check bits, and it's not perfect. Maybe if you give each check bit a check bit.
That's what I was going to say. Is you could have a check bit for every bit, and then you have a check bit for that too.
Yeah. So much like this system, you would be able to detect all 1-bit and 2-bit errors. You would not be able to detect all 3-bit errors, unlike this system, which does not use 3 times as many bits of checking as, yeah. So anywho, that's one way to do it. That's kind of the engineer in Nathan coming out, just showing off all of his various ingenuity and love of elegant solutions to problems like this. So yeah. So we're finally ready for our 2 theorems, and these can be mathematically proven with a lot of work because these are kind of elaborate claims that are being made, but I don't know how to do the math. I don't know how to explain the math, so we're just going to say them. So this is the Shannon-Hartley theorem, and so the channel capacity of a information system, so that's how many bits per second can be transmitted, or at least the theoretical upper bound of how many bits can be translated, is equal to the bandwidth times the log of 1 plus the signal to noise ratio. So we've discussed the bandwidth before. The greater the bandwidth, the more individual data points you're transmitting per second. And so we're familiar with that from part 1 of the talk, but also very important to how much bits per second you can communicate is the signal to noise ratio. And it's basically just mathematically, as signal to noise goes up, bits per second go up. And typically for your communication channel, you are not near this channel capacity if you're sending a digital signal. If you're sending an analog signal, you could consider yourself to always be at channel capacity, because as long as you can read it at that capacity, it's at that capacity. But with a digital signal, if you are nearing your channel capacity, you risk the signal kind of messing up and not giving you too many errors. And we kind of addressed that in the second point, the noisy channel coding theorem. So for any given degree of noise contamination in a communications channel, it is possible to communicate discrete data at an arbitrarily low error rate up to a computable maximum rate. So what this is saying is, even if we have a crazy amount of noise and not very low signal, we can basically do Nathan's strategy, or a more efficient version of Nathan's strategy, and transmit data slower. So Nathan's strategy with the check bit and the check bit for the check bit transmits data at 1/3 the rate of time. So rather than transmitting 3 bits per second, you're only transmitting 1 bit per second. but your probability of error is lower, and you can choose any % error probability you want other than 0, but you can choose any arbitrarily low error probability you want, and you can communicate at that rate as long as you have enough correction in there, basically. You can communicate those bits. So it might not be obvious, maybe it is, hopefully it is, but what follows from these two theorems is that there really is an equivalence in analog and digital communication schemes in terms of channel capacity. So if you have a given channel, the amount of information it's conveying, whether it's digital or analog, doesn't really have anything to do with whether it's digital and analog. In fact, mathematically, they can be proven to be equivalent. What matters is the signal-to-noise ratio of your communication channel. So we're going to answer the question of, is analog better than digital, on the next slide. But are there any guesses as to which of the two has the better signal-to-noise ratio?
I mean, it would have to be digital, right? Because
in pretty much every case, I think Leo's presentation had some good examples of cases where it's not the case with photography, but in almost every case, yes. So Pat, would you like to guess whether a VHS tape or a Blu-ray would you like to guess which one has a higher signal-to-noise ratio?
based on watching a lot of VHS tapes in the 90s, I'm going to guess Blu-ray.
I believe that is right. I have not externally verified it, but I believe that is right. I'm not sure, Nathan, if you have any counterpoints you want to weigh in with, but.
There are a number of film buffs and experts, Guinness Book record holders, who maintain that the claim that Blu-ray has higher quality than VHS is very much up for debate.
Yeah,
and
we don't have to get into this now. I do have some of his writings later on in this presentation, but so we're going to assess this, and I'm actually just going to read a whole paragraph from the Philips website because they explain it much better than I can. But we are asking the question specifically, like, hey, these 16 bits offered by a CD, an LP has infinite bits because it's an analog system. And anywhere between the bits you can go. You got it all. But what does Philips have to say? And I guess they are a little, they have some interests in making CDs seem good, but let's just take a look at it. So while analog technology allows for a signal-to-noise ratio of only 60 decibels or less, so that is your record, and 60 decibels, 20 decibels is 10, so 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. So for a record, your signal-to-noise ratio is approximately 1,000 to 1. And a low channel separation of less than 30 decibels, the compact disc offers a much higher performance. The digital signal processing means that both the signal-to-noise ratio and channel separation, I don't know what channel separation is, by the way, you can Google it if you want to, are higher than 90 decibels. So we're looking at better than records by a factor of 30 in terms of signal-to-noise ratio. I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Because a 1.2 millimeter thick transparent layer protects the digital information on the compact disc, damage and dust are not in the focal plane of the laser, which is used to read the disc, so that they have little influence on reproduction. And most of the faults that arise can be corrected thanks to digital signal processing. This is because the information stored on the disc also contains error correction bits. If there are so many errors that correction is no longer possible, so if you have a scratch on your CD, for example, these can be detected and masked according to a defined procedure. If you have a scratch on your LP, you're pretty fucked. So the chance that consumers will hear any of the clicks that are so well known from LPs is virtually eliminated.
Do you have any idea what their defined procedure, if it's detected and masked, is?
I don't.
I can speculate, and I think it skips forward like half a second. Like, when a CD skips, I would assume it's something to that effect. Maybe not even half a second, but like if you have a CD that's all scratched up and you're playing it, and like that one song at 2 minutes like has a skip.
Yep.
something like that.
But
Maybe.
that's like equivalent to a record where sometimes there's the messed up groove in your record and it'll either repeat, or skip past a part.
I was wondering if maybe
But
that's some
if
sort
like
of interpolation
yeah,
that it
so that's
does,
what I was going to say, Nathan, is if
or
a single one of these data points here is missing, I'm sure they can interpolate it quite easily, and that
just like
will be pretty seamless.
like a solid 140 decibel 10 kilohertz tone is played and that is missing.
Another advantage of the CD is that you can like sample 10 seconds in advance while you're spinning the CD. So if you bump your Discman while you're listening to it, it can kind of it has 10 seconds stored in its memory. And additionally, I don't go into this in the talk, but when it comes to interpreting signals, you can do a lot better interpolation. I mean, obviously, you can do a lot better interpolation if you're already thinking 10 seconds in advance. If you can't see the future at all, you can extrapolate, but you can't interpolate. But because the CD-ROM is digital and it can kind of look into the future, it can do that interpolation pretty accurately. So yeah, all right. That is my presentation. And I have the Movie Heads newsletter, The Case Against DVDs here, as well as a fun audiophile meme about how any true audiophile has a custom-built Faraday cage around their sound listening experience to make sure you don't get any stray signals coming in and ruining your sound.
So I imagine that's an even better setup than I've read about people who they align their like music transmission cables to like not be perpendicular to the magnetic field lines of the earth. So I imagine Faraday cage is even better.
Yeah, magnetic field of the earth, fuck you. So I will say in defense of the Virgin audiophile, there is something to be said for replicating the sound that the artist hears when they're like mastering the track, basically. And so, for example, that's the importance of not listening to it on Beats Audio, where the bass is 3 times as loud. And so that's some of what people can get obsessive about. And people can also get obsessive about like directly replicating the sound of a concert in their own home. I've read accounts of people who that is like their obsession, is making it so it sounds like you are at a concert. And like finding bootleg recordings that have excellent audio quality so you can be at a concert in your own home basically without having to be surrounded by normies at the concert experience with you. So, and I get it. I obviously have not embarked down that path quite yet, but who knows, maybe someday I can do my concert replication in my Faraday cage. But so there's more than just analog versus digital in terms of being an obsessive audiophile, but certainly the analog versus digital question is answered very, very convincingly.
I don't know. I think that so this letter on the right, for those who don't know, is written by Greg Turkington, who is one of the foremost film buffs around, Guinness Book world record holder for 501 movies in 501 days. And he operates the Victorville Film Archive, which is one of the largest movie collections in North America. And he makes a lot of good points here about what are some of the best ones.
Blu-ray is a joke.
DVDs can break really easily.
I have broken a DVD taking it out of the jewel case.
Yeah, you can break it taking out the jewel case, or you get stuck in the DVD player. There's also the matter of they don't make VHS tapes anymore. So, you can record your own VHS tapes. Like if The Hobbit is playing on TV, you can record it, but you can't as easily do that with a Blu-ray.
I've had all these problems and more. I'll just say Mr. Turkington's points resonate very strongly at my house because my sister, I've broken it more than one DVD actually trying to take it out of the jewel case. I think we had a Monty Python
You can press the button in the middle.
Yes,
and
no, believe me, we had a Monty Python disc set that had like malformed cases or something, and it was almost impossible to get them out without breaking them. And my sister, when she was a kid, used to, whenever she wanted to watch a movie, would just put the DVD in the player, regardless of whether there was a DVD in there already. So many, many times we had to open up the DVD player to remove the second DVD.
There's also Yeah, he is well known for he set up he has a VHS player plugged into a projector they set up in a movie theater, and he claims that it rivals and perhaps even surpasses 35 millimeter film in its quality. So, you know, I think 35 millimeter film is kind of considered the pinnacle of digital. So, yeah.
This is unrelated, but I have a story that I wanted to tell, but not earlier because it would derail. You were on a roll. I didn't want to derail your presentation. But so going back to Nyquist sampling, there is a hockey player named Gustav Nyquist who
I'm
played
familiar.
for the Blue Jays. And I used to be an avid hockey fan before hockey no longer existed. But so I was obviously on r/NHL, and they had a big thread about Nyquist, and I left a comment saying, I came to this thread looking for a sampling theorem joke and left with twice the disappointment, and I was banned from r/. And that's the end.
Lesson learned.
Don't make Nyquist sampling theorem jokes on Reddit.
I have a question about the substance of the presentation, incredibly, despite almost having understood almost none of it. I'm not a big music head, as you guys know. I don't really understand it. I don't listen to it that much, but I was reading the other day about Phil Spector, the producer, who I believe is now in prison for murder. But his signature style was the wall of sound. Are you guys familiar with this?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the scheme was that, correct me if I'm wrong, he would essentially have all of the parts played by the guitar part would actually be played by 6 different guitars, a couple pianos, like a harpsichord. And I think this was in the 60s, and it was not, you couldn't really discern all these instruments on the actual recording. Maybe you could on the master or something. But the point was just to make it loud and to have these very varied tones. I guess, how does that fit into this sort of thing? Or no?
Yeah. So I mean, part of that is what he's doing that other people aren't doing is he is using his full frequency domain here. So he's kind of using there's a lot going on at the high pitch and the low pitch and the medium pitch and everywhere in between. So in terms of information being communicated, if you will, there are more bits per second in a wall of sound song than there is in a song kind of where you're just a single violin playing or whatever. So
right.
you could think of it that way. I think a lot of it is also just the fact that technology, multi-track technology, for example, is pretty it's pretty recent. By pretty recent, I mean I believe the Beatles are one of the first bands to be able to multi-track things, and you couldn't just put your 30 little tracks on top of one another on GarageBand. You had to record 4 tracks, and then you could record over that tape with another 4 tracks and kind of combine them together, or record over your own recording. And so that's another thing that singers will do to make their voice sound really good now, is they'll record themselves singing 16 times, play them all over one another, and any warbles in your voice is only in one of the 16 tracks. So when you're multi-tracking your vocal recording, it sounds like you have a very smooth, buttery voice.
Cool. Interesting.
So maybe that is also the case for wall of sound. That I'm not sure about.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So you neglected to address anything about the current leader in digital cyborg industries.
I mean, we discussed that, and so I think one of the things that Cyborg Industries is doing is communicating in multiple frequencies, sending. I forget how fiber optic cable works actually, but that's a thing that's commonly done, is on your fiber optic cables that are sending your internet signal across the Pacific Ocean or whatever. I believe they send like 32 different frequencies that are all on top of one another through the same fiber optic cable, and they can all be separated from one another because
I
when you
think
think about
that was a process invented by like Bell Telephone in like
yeah,
20s, so they could send more than one phone call at a time.
because when you think about it, you're looking at your frequency domain. All of those are completely separate from one another. When you look at your Laplace transform, you're when you add up all of those things, as long as you have a large enough sample size, you can 100% separate them from one another. So it's a concept that works, but as you said, it's a concept that has existed for a very long time and is commonly used in fiber optics cable. I don't know a lot about that. I learned that in like a NOVA documentary on PBS or something. But
Why are brick wall filters impossible?
so here's a thing about impulse responses in real life. So in real life, your impulse response has to all be after zero, because you can't predict the future. It has to be after zero. And so, for example, this one it's zero up until you hit this second, when you apply the impulse, and then it does stuff. The transfer function of a brick wall filter is this right here, this. So you can think of this as a signal, but you can also think of it as a brick wall filter. They're the same thing, a pulse and a brick wall filter, like a rectangular pulse. And so if you were to actually look at the transfer function of this, this is the transfer function. So because we were talking about how transfer functions and Laplace transforms are the same. And so the idea is that you would have to know all the way to the very beginning of the signal, all the way to the very end of the signal to do your convolution or whatever to do that. I think I'm wrong. I don't know. Yeah, so here we're looking at the signal in the time domain. We're looking at this brick wall in the time domain and this in the frequency domain. But one of the things about Laplace transforms is you can just swap them. Like if your Laplace transform of x is y, then your Laplace transform of y is x, basically. And so if you had this signal in the Laplace domain, or this curve in the Laplace or the Fourier domain, your transfer function as a function of time would look like this. And you can't have a transfer function of time that has values before zero because it requires you to see into the future. Good question, very good question. All right, well, Nathan, I believe you're on for next week with a presentation about Mr. Musk.
Oh yeah.
Oh, can I ask is the next week after that spoken for?
No, I had an idea, but if you want to do one, go for it.
I'm happy to go after you or that week. I just would be curious if you guys would be more interested, or if the group would be more interested in the laws that apply to white collar crime or in QAnon.
The laws that apply to QAnon or just QAnon in general?
Just QAnon itself, just general QAnon.